Clippers, limiters, and maximizers. Three things you've undoubtedly heard about if you've been watching a lot of YouTube videos and a lot of YouTube tutorials like this one. I myself definitely encountered these three processes and I always got it mixed up. I never really understood when to use which one or really what the difference between the three of them were. Well, if you're like me a few years ago, what I wanted to do in today's video is break down the difference between these processes, and not only that, but how to think about using them and when to specifically pull up each one. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece, producer and engineer extraordinaire. I'm really excited to tackle today's topic because after doing a lot of research, I haven't found a lot of videos that actually cover all three of these processes. I've definitely seen some that only talk about limiting and clipping or limiting and maximizing, but rarely have I seen all three in a single video. And I'm glad that you're tuning in because I'm definitely going to break down the difference between these processes for you, and more importantly, let you know how you should be thinking about using these in your own mixes. So with all that being said, let's jump on to Pro Tools and I'll show you what's going on. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to define each process and maybe show you an example. And then from there, I want to actually distinguish between each of these three plugins, between clipping, limiting, and maximizing, and let you know when you should be actually thinking about using each one. For your convenience, I've left some chapter markers down below because maybe you're familiar with some of this stuff and you just want to get to the goods. Definitely use that if that's helpful for you. The first thing we need to understand about these three processes is they all focus on solving the same issue, but they do it in their own unique way, and at the same time create a different sonic characteristic, a different sound by using each one. Some are better suited to certain situations than others, and we're going to talk about that. But the main problem that these processes deal with is it prevents clipping. You're going to apply a clipper, a limiter, or a maximizer to essentially prevent clipping and at the same time drive or increase the level of a signal. This is pretty straightforward stuff, right? You want something louder and you want to prevent it from clipping. You can rely on any of these three processes to do that, but like I said, some are better suited at some jobs than others. So let's talk about the first process here, which is clipping. A clipper essentially prevents a peak from happening altogether. It completely chops it off or shaves it. And this is really good for certain types of materials, specifically transients. So things like drums really benefit from using a clipper over a maximizer or a limiter. But when it comes to actual drum sounds, percussive elements, and maybe even things like arpeggios, guitars, and keyboards that have really strong attacks, you may want to actually use a clipper instead of a limiter or a maximizer, and that's how I like to use it. But we do have to remember that a clipper is a very aggressive process because it literally clips the peaks. It prevents any peaking from happening, and at the same time, that usually creates a very specific sound. Now, this sound is not so smooth. It can be very aggressive, and that's going to depend a lot on the mode or style that you use. You might be familiar with this, but you might have heard of soft clipping and hard clipping, right? Soft clipping is generally a warmer, rounder type of sound, whereas hard clipping is a lot more aggressive. Clipping in general is a lot more of an effect, right? You can see a lot of clippers have a built-in saturation. A lot of times people are actually applying clipping to specifically get that effect on a sound or to specifically impart some sort of saturation or harmonic manipulation to a sound in the process. And this particular plugin, Standard Clip, it actually has a saturation curve that I could turn up and increase, and it's really going to drive a lot of the high frequency content especially and make that a lot more noticeable and apparent in a song, potentially to a fault if you're not careful. Now, soft clipping is generally going to create a rounder curve, right? Whereas a hard clip is going to be a little bit more jagged. Sometimes it's not so easy to tell here, but that's obviously going to impart a different sound. And you can see here, depending on which mode that I put myself into, I have access to the saturator or I don't. In a hard clip, I don't. In the soft clip modes, I do. And most clippers have similar parameters. Usually it's a gain and a clip. Some might actually have a ceiling as well. It really depends on which plugin you're using, but ultimately the clip is going to determine at what point the signal gets clipped. So this is basically like a threshold or a limit, right? It's going to prevent it from essentially passing this point. So let's say minus 0.2, and then I could drive the gain up and really increase the volume going into this clipping. So it's going to basically increase the volume of a signal overall, but then prevent it from peaking by using this clip parameter that I've set up. So really quickly, let's actually just see what this sounds like. Let's actually push it a little bit and do a 2 dB gain with a 0.2 dB clip. clip, and I'll take it out and put it in. Let's see what it's doing. You'll definitely see some gain reduction down here, if anything, depending on the volume of the signal, and I'm definitely going to adjust this as we go. So here we go. So obviously we can hear that it's louder. That's going to happen with pretty much all of these processes, but it's really about how it's processing the signal. You see that I was able to push it at different times, and of course the more I pushed it and the harder that it clipped, sometimes it didn't sound the best, right? It sounded clicked. It sounded popped, really, and not that great. It's not something that I would definitely strive to do, but I don't mind using a clipper to just gently push things up maybe 1 to 2 dB while also preventing that clipping. Now again, this is much better suited to transient material, so things like drums, drum groups, individual drum sounds, any kind of percussive element, arpeggios, arpeggiations, guitars. Anything that has that strong attack, as I mentioned, is definitely a good thing to use the clipper for. But again, you may want to play with this because it's not always going to work so well. And even though you see other people using it all the time, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. And clipping is definitely something that is easy to overdo and create a lot of problems because it's a very specific sound. To be fair, I am applying this to an entire master, right? An instrumental master where all the sounds are feeding to. This could potentially be problematic and may not be the best situation for it. In fact, I may not actually do this like this. I would much rather take it and put it on an actual individual sound, or maybe a group that is specifically very transient dense, like a drum bus, as I've mentioned. So with clipping out of the way, let's talk next about maximizing and limiting specifically. And the reason why I want to talk about both at the same time is because they're a very similar process. And the truth is, a lot of people don't realize that these are essentially doing the exact same thing, but in a slightly different way from one another. Even me, when I've done some research, I've had a very hard time finding out exactly what the difference is between a maximizer and limiter, but I've kind of reduced it to this initial thought. Basically, a limiter is a extreme form of compression. In fact, if you were to set a compressor to a 10-to-1 ratio or greater than that and play with the attack time, even making the attack time faster, it's pretty much going to be functioning as a limiter. A limiter prevents a sound from clipping and then adds volume back to compensate for that loss. Now, a maximizer does that in a very similar fashion, but in a slightly inverted order, in the sense that a maximizer is trying to maximize volume. So what that means is it's going to actually add volume first, and then it's going to prevent the clipping. So what you're going to basically do is you're going to be driving up the level of the overall track, and then anything that gets too excessively loud that passes the ceiling that you've set, the maximizer is essentially going to limit that or prevent that from, of course, actually clipping and reaching digital zero. And the amount of headroom, of course, is going to depend on the out ceiling that you set up. Really, both of these do things the exact same way, but the limiter first prevents clipping and then drives up the level. The maximizer first drives up the level and then prevents the clipping. Hopefully this makes sense, but that's at least how I've begun to understand these two different processes. But the truth is I use them both extremely interchangeably. They basically function exactly the same, and you'll see it. People will be talking about a limiter, but then they'll be using a maximizer, and vice versa. Obviously, there isn't that much of a difference between the two of them, but they are, of course, different from a clipper, which is essentially just fully clipping a signal in the first place. Now, the benefit of both of these is that they're way more transparent than clipping. They're not really going to impart a sound like a clipper would, right? A clipper has a built-in saturator as well, and that could really enhance or change a sound, whereas these are really just going to take whatever it's being given and then drive the level up while at the same time preventing clipping, and that should be perceived as a little bit more transparent and not as noticeable. So with that in mind, let's actually put each of these in, and I'm going to try to match the level as best as I can, but I'm doing this on the fly. So you see we've added about 2.8 dB of gain, and we're adding about a 0.2 of clip point here, so that's basically the ceiling, right? So if I were to do the same thing here, I could set the out ceiling to 0.2, and I could set the threshold to minus 2.8. Let's see how this handles that, and I'm of course going to get rid of my Pro L as well. So even though the settings are roughly the same, they're obviously not level matched. When I went back and forth with the Clipper was significantly louder, and it was adding a lot more to the drums, as you may have been able to tell. When I looked at the peak volume on both, you could see that we're hitting about minus 0.4 with this maximizer, whereas the Clipper was reaching about 0 even, which is pretty interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drive this up another 0.4. So I'm going to take it up to minus 3.2. Let's see if this is matched a little bit better. They're a little bit closer, but of course the maximizer sounds a bit more subdued, especially the transients. So hopefully you can hear the difference between the two of them. Again, they're definitely processing things a little bit differently. And I do want to mention that even though I said, set the clip to minus 0.2, that's not exactly the same as the ceiling. This is just letting it know when to actually clip the signal. But if I want to be super careful, I could turn on the ceiling here, set it to minus 0.2, so then we're fully matched here. I apologize. I should have done that sooner, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page because I know someone is definitely going to say something in the comments, as always. Let's actually do the limiter next. Now, the beauty of the limiter is because it's like a compressor or an extreme form of compression, you have a few additional parameters usually, the attack, the release, some of them have a look ahead time, and of course you have your gain, which is going to be used to just drive up the level after preventing the peaking. First things first, let's set the out ceiling to minus 0.2, and I'm going to just add 2.8, just like we did on the Clipper. And I find that the Pro L2 always sounds the most transparent of all, especially when we focus on using different styles here. I'll actually use the transparent style as well. But let's just hear what this sounds like, and I'm definitely going to shoot it out with the other two plugins. Let's do original sound, then Clipper, then maximizer, then limiter. All right, so I kind of purposely focused on the clipper and the limiter at the very end of that, if you noticed. And that's because I thought those two honestly sounded the best. I actually am not really feeling the maximizer in this particular case. But of course, that changes. Sometimes I like to use the maximizer over a limiter. Sometimes I do something else. And the truth is, sometimes I use all three in series with one another, but I'm obviously manipulating them a little bit differently. Whereas right now, I'm purposely trying to push this maybe a little bit beyond than even where I would normally go to get a specific response so that you can really hear what each of them is doing. But for me, the real giveaway is the kick and the clap, okay? That's what's really triggering each of these processes. I find that the clipper treats the clap a little bit better, but it's affecting the kick in a negative way and the low end in a negative way. The maximizer I find is just completely dulling the drums in general in this particular case, and the limiter I find is actually sort of the best of both worlds, where it's processing the transients pretty smoothly, at least from my current perception. The kick and the clap are coming through fairly clearly. It's not being suppressed too much, and I like what it's doing the best. So as you can tell, sometimes you want to shoot out all three, and there's of course more advanced techniques of combining them. As I said, I'll definitely be shooting some videos in the coming weeks about that, and if I ever do drop them, I will leave a link either up above right now or in the description below when those come out. So really all three of these processes can be used for the exact same goal, preventing clipping, right? If you have a very loud signal, or if you have a signal that you want to push a little bit louder but prevent it from clipping, you can use any of these processes. Now the clipper has a much more specific sound, especially depending on if you're using the soft or hard modes that it comes with. A lot of people prefer to use clippers on transient dense material, specifically things like drums and percussive elements. So if you're mixing drums and you want to apply a process to increase the loudness and prevent clipping, a clipper may be the best approach for you, but you could also technically use a maximizer and a limiter as well for the same job. But a clipper usually lends itself a little bit better more often than not, right? In this case, I definitely am not liking what it's doing to my kick, but I definitely think it could be something that may work on an individual sound especially. Now with the maximizer and the limiter, once again, these two processes can be used interchangeably. Remember, each plugin is going to have its own sound that it's going to impart. It's going to affect the tonality of a signal a little bit differently, and that goes for pretty much every plugin there is. So you can use either a maximizer or a limiter, and I prefer to use these especially on buses and masters, right? As you can tell here, the clipper was cool, but it might be doing a little bit too much to this overall instrumental master that I'm applying it to. It might actually be better suited to using it on an individual drum bus, as I mentioned. Whereas the maximizer and the limiter, that's dealing with all the material a little bit better, a little bit more transparently and less aggressively, especially that limiter that I mentioned. So as you can tell, you really want to focus on using the clipper on individual sounds and percussive sounds, transient dense sounds, especially, and potentially groups that are also fall into that category, like a drum group. And you want to use the maximizer and the limiter also on groups and submasters, but also on the master as well, because it's going to deal with things a lot more transparently and not affect the material so aggressively as a clipper may. Now for me, I definitely prefer to use the limiter above all else. A limiter is essentially an extreme form of compression that you can push a specific direction and it really increase the loudness, but I also find that what it does is it preserves the peaks a little bit better, a little bit cleaner than these other processes that I've mentioned. However, adding a maximizer to an individual sound like a bass can also sometimes be a really amazing thing. I've definitely done mixes where I've applied, an isotope maximizer to an 808 and driven the level, and I've gotten something out of it that other processes just couldn't. Like the limiter couldn't, the clipper couldn't, nothing else could do it. I had to just take a maximizer and crank that thing to stun, and for whatever reason, I got the reaction I wanted out of it. Hopefully this makes sense, but I really want to make sure that you understand how each of these processes differ and how you can ultimately incorporate each one into your mixes, and you'll usually find all of them at some point in a mix, whether it's a clipper on an individual drum channel, and then a maximizer on an individual 808 channel, or a group, and then a limiter on my overall master, as you might suspect. But what did you think? Did you find this video helpful? Do you better understand the difference between these three processes and when to use them in your mixes? I really hope so. And if it did help you, if you did find this video helpful and you like what you saw, please smash that like button until it turns blue. It means so much to me because it would not only help my channel reach more people like yourself, but also help you because you'll see more of my helpful content that I post on a weekly basis. I'd love to continue helping you on your journey, but I need you to pay the small fee. Like the video, and if you're new here and haven't subscribed before, definitely subscribe so you can see this content when it goes live. If you want to see anything in a future video, leave your request down below and feel free to ask me any questions as well. Love to help you guys, and I'm looking forward to helping you again on the next one. All right? Peace.
5.